Welcome to the Value Make Podcast. My name is Ryan Purvis. I'm your host, supported right here at the Big Mill, as we meet with the people that make the digital workspace work. It's about the technology. It's about improving people's work experience and finding the return on value. Thanks for joining us on the show. Please like and subscribe and share with your colleagues. It helps us grow the podcast, and we appreciate any help you can give us.
Well, let's kick off. So, Adam, welcome to the Value Makers Podcast. I almost said welcome to Digital Workspace Works Podcast, but that's what we used to call it. But obviously a mouthful. Do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, it's great to be here. No, my name's Adam. I've been a coach for CTOs for the last sort of 10, 12 years, coaching professionally for the last couple of years. And I've been prior to that, sort of 30 years in the industry, which means that I sort of came into the industry last century, which it dates me somewhat.
Well, you don't look like you're from last century.
Thank you very much. So yes, I've been in the IT industry all the way through, although jumping around all over the place. I've gone consulting, I've done, investment banking, I've done, hyper growth US Silicon Valley startup. I've been a founder myself in the fintech space. I now live in Sweden, in Gothenburg, in the west of Sweden. So I still used to a very rainy place. It just gets a little bit colder here than it does in the UK.
and the Swedes are a little bit more direct and blunt than
the local. Can be, but I do like the refreshing, straightforward approach to there.
Yeah, 100%. So a couple questions, I guess. When you say coach, are you a qualified coach, or do you just use coach as a verb?
No, it's a brilliant question, that, because no, and I don't think I'll ever be one of those qualified coaches. And the reason for that is because of my approach to coaching. So my approach to coaching is that I blend together coaching, teaching, and mentoring. And just to sort of give a bit of background on what that is, coaching is the classic stuff. What's blocking you? What's holding you back? What are your fears? What do you need to unblock in order to move forward? Teaching is, well, what are the things that I don't know? What are the things that I need to learn? What are the frameworks I've never encountered before that I've never had exposure to that will help me? And then mentoring, it kind of falls into two things. Mentoring is, on one part, it's holding you to account. Are you going to do the things you said you're going to do? What's your progress on the things you aimed to go for? And on the other hand, also mentoring is sort of being that sounding board where, you talk to somebody, throw some ideas at the wall, see what sticks. My background there makes for quite a good approach when somebody says, I've got this idea, I'm thinking of doing this. And I can say, yeah, great idea. Think structure like this. Or, yeah, no, I've tried that one before. That's not great. So I blend those three things together. Now, most of the coaching institutes and qualification process and so on go, thou shalt coach and nothing else, because that's not coaching. So I'll never fit into that bucket. And the reason for that really is because of the journey that leaders get to in tech on their way through don't tend to have the same exposure that people end up in the chief revenue officer role, chief marketing officer role, or the chief finance officer role, where they've had this grounding in selling, communication, and in bridging between people and collaboration. As engineers, it's very much a solo profession. You sit down on the computer, we code, we throw things into a pull request, wait for the comments to come back, work on it, and done. We don't tend to end up with a really good grounding in communication, listening skills, and all these things. So we sort of miss out on a lot of these frameworks that the rest of the C-suite have had drilled into them in order to get to where they are.
Well, I mean, and that's one of the problems with the CTO title is that often, and especially in recent times, the CTO title has been confused or obscured with a technical lead/lead developer.
Yeah, it could be anything from the tech founder all the way through to the seasoned executive who's running a department of several thousand people. And then the other thing is that the chief revenue officer, the chief finance officer, these are things that the chief finance officer has been at least a role, if not a title, since sort of Venetian banking came along, right? But then you look at the CTO. Well, the first CTO titles were awarded in the late 1980s. We're talking about a role that's just over 40 years old. Yeah. And the amount of change and evolution that's happened in that time is immense. And it can be anything from somebody who's in charge of the scientific approach for a business to somebody who is in charge of R&D research to somebody who's in charge of a software team of 3 people. And because of that, what is a CTO? Wow, that we could spend an entire podcast doing just that.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been in those roles myself, so I could tell and often it's just the person that understands technology, and you're doing internal IT support, you're doing personal iPad support, you're doing building product, whatever it is. Basically, anything technology gets thrown at you and say, sort this out.
Yeah,
rightly or wrongly, depending on the circumstances. And then you see sort of this plethora of other titles that are also similar. Chief Digital Officer, you still have a Chief Information Officer, you even have security, CISOs as a separate realm, which I agree should be separate.
Subsets, yeah.
You have a Chief Data Officer, you have it just, it keeps continuing out to spread because I think it is such a difficult thing to group.
Well, also because what's expected of information technology is getting wider and wider. In the 1980s, when there were the first CTOs, it was a specialist thing. Okay, we've now got an entire software development department. We're supporting our own software in a constructive way at the executive level. That was sort of the first time it became a business enabler. Whereas now, almost every company has a significant technology component to it, even if that is just relying on off-the-shelf third-party components to run the business. Yeah, and there's a blurred line and discussion about what is a CIO versus what is a CTO. But at the end of the day, the business relies on technology. There are very, very few businesses these days that don't.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I know there are a lot of businesses that end up building their own stuff. And I still think some cases, they shouldn't really be building their own stuff. They should be buying it or subscribing to it or whatever it is.
Or in many cases, it was worth building at the time because what they needed was bespoke and didn't exist. Whereas now there's plenty of third-party tools that with just a little few tweaks and configuration does what your internal tool now does. So sometimes time has caught up with what companies have done in order to get to where they are.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at the amount of Excel spreadsheets that run a business. And how many of those, they built in Excel because someone spent a weekend building the Excel spreadsheet and they become the owner of the Excel spreadsheet and they've learned macros and all that kind of stuff. And then that person basically has a job forever because the business runs on the Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, exactly. And I think things like Cursor and Lovable are the new version of Excel from that perspective. Spend a weekend throwing together an application that does our customized in-house CRM. Don't need all the things that Salesforce connects to, just need to look after these people and connect to these two systems. There we go, bang a system together, great. And that's kind of now the new version of Excel, running entire businesses on those things. So we're going to have the same thing again.
Yeah, and I mean, I was chatting with some other founders the other day, and I think the other problem that you have is that there's so many tools out there to use to do something. I look at what we're trying to do with the podcast. We have HubSpot for our CRM, we have Calendly for booking, we have ConvertKit or Kit now for our newsletter. Do I move that in all into HubSpot? Well, HubSpot will charge me £800 a month if I do it in there, or pay $80 in Kit, but Kit doesn't do all the integrations that I want with HubSpot. So, even a person that understands technology, I'm sitting going, I don't know what tools to use. And
how to make the cost reasonable as well.
Oh, that's it as well. And I mean, I went down the route of going to some other CRM system that was a known, what's a no-name brand. I mean, it obviously exists and whatever, and having it all in one platform, but it couldn't do. Like when I could get away with the free version of HubSpot, I couldn't do with the paid version of this product. And you're just constantly sitting with this up and down.
Yeah.
Where do we spend our time? And I wonder if with the advent of AI and agents and all that stuff, are all these things that were built as verticals, a CRM tool, an ERP system, a knowledge management system, are they just going to blur into one big blob of things? And your AI is going to give you perspective. And you say, okay, you want to do you want to get the document version of this thing? Well, just throw it into the blob and it'll come out when you ask for it. What's our process? Well, the blob has determined that your sales process is X, Y, and Z, and you're currently in this state because it's constantly thinking about it and reorganize it. I mean, is that what we're looking at in the future? Potentially, I don't know.
Yeah, and it's going to take a while for it to shake out. And I think there'll be plenty of businesses that try any and all of those business models and sell them to various different companies. So I think we're going to move into an era of massive confusion, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about what is the right thing to do, the best thing to do. And that will differ, of course, from size of company, industry, data complexity, and also a lot of the other constraints, privacy, what we're allowed to do with the data, how regulated a particular industry is, etc. So yeah, sometimes going into the blob might be significantly covered by regulations in terms of what you're allowed to do with that. How much can you trust the AI or the AI built tools to do all of that stuff correctly as well? Maybe in time, that'll be rock solid, but right now,
well, I think we are in that uncertainty confusion stage. I mean, even OpenAI, I think I saw it yesterday or this morning, has said that they're going to GDP5 will now be everything in one, instead of you having to know which model to use for what, which makes sense. I mean, it's a logical way to go with the roadmap. Changing tack for a second, I've seen a lot of advertisements now for a CTO course, qualification, certification. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've seen several. So there's the one from Cambridge. There's an organization that's popped up recently from CTO Academy. which is a very bespoke course on becoming a CTO. There is the sort of course materials and available information on things like CTO craft. I think Oxford now have a course that they put together recently as well through the Said Business School. So there's various different sort of executive education for CTOs. And are they valid? Yeah, they're all valid. Are they all worthwhile? I think that really does depend on what it is that you want to do. If you want to go from your, senior technology job, running a team or multiple teams of, several dozens of people, and you want to go from there up to being an executive CTO in an enterprise, then one of the MBA style courses from a known business school, yeah, it's probably more worthwhile than a traditional MBA, because they're now sort of targeting down on what it is you need to do as a CTO, and the difference between sort of baseline skills from somebody going into an MBA versus somebody who's coming from a engineering manager or a VP engineering type role. Then there's the sort of CTO academy, sort of the so-called, unlicensed or unqualified ones, where you come out with a qualification from CTO academy, no higher sort of authority saying, yeah, this is good to go. And those are very useful from the point of view of getting practical and background theory, knowledge, and some experience. Plus also, of course, what you get out of those education processes is a really good network to help you on your next step. So I think all of those are valid. And then there's the other thing where they call the poor man's MBA, which is just become a founder. And that's what I did, kind of learning things the hard way. There's the school of hard knocks, or however you want to call it. And, you come out with an appropriate level of knowledge and skills compared to what you put into it and where you wanted to go by choosing, an appropriate course as you go into them. So to come back to your question, are they valid? Are they good? Yeah, all of them, for what you want to do. And so in some cases you want to go that approach, and in other cases you want to just jump into the role and bring a coach on board and help you with the areas where you need to level up. And that's also an appropriate route. And I think there's a lot of companies now that are beginning to realize, especially those that are backed by either private equity or VC, where they go, we know what good looks like. We invest in the founders, here's the founders, but there's a gap between what they have done previously and where they need to go in order to achieve the ambitions of this particular fund or this particular outcome. And so then they apply additional help, fractional CTOs, coaches like myself, to basically to cover that gap. And that's also a totally appropriate learning path and growth path, because it's going where you need to go for that particular business.
How do you differentiate yourself from a fractional CTO and what you do?
My focus as a coach is on helping the individual. When it's a fractional CTO, it's about helping the business. Now, that's sort of the headline outside look at it. Practically, when you're in a business, is there a lot of difference? Sometimes there is a difference when there isn't anybody in the business who is a senior experienced technologist of any kind. Then you're the fractional CTO, they're kind of the only experienced technologist, and everybody else is, the equivalent of individual contributors, developers working on code. In other cases, it's a very blurry, murky line between the two. You've got somebody in the business who's got all the domain knowledge, which is a fairly crucial component. They've got experience in that industry. They have perhaps been leading a couple of teams even previously, maybe even they've been leading leaders up until now, but they just don't have experience at that sort of board level, executive team level, the C-suite input. And so if I go into those organizations as a fractional CTO, actually what I do resembles much more closely my coaching work than it does the fractional work that I'm technically hired on for. So yeah, it's a very blurry line actually, and it really does depend on who's in the business, how specific the industry vertical knowledge is, and how necessary it is for that kind of business. And of course, whether it's a tech first company or whether it's a tech enabled company, in terms of their approach to what they do for technology and how they actually earn their dollars at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think there's a level of being a translation layer or an educator. And I don't mean educator in a condescending way, but I worked with a really good CEO who was a captain of a ship for 25 years, tankers and all the rest of it. And he would spend all his weekends studying courses. So, he learned how to code. He learned how to do product management, project management. So,
ambitious guy.
No, very. And I mean, after 3.5 years with him, he would come, and he is one of those people. He would come and say, when you started telling me this stuff 3 years ago, and I didn't believe you, now that I've been on the journey with you and I now understand when you say it sounds simple, but it's complicated. And usually the simpler it sounds, the more complicated it is.
Yeah.
He said, now I understand it because now I've coded, I've done this, I've done testing, all that he'd experienced, he's become a CTO basically, and he's
Yeah.
educated himself. But most boards don't do that for
No.
various reasons.
And when you said, I think you said translator, I tend to prefer the word interpreter because translator kind of confers that it's two separate languages, whereas interpreter, you can be interpreting from one domain to another, one set of knowledge to another, using the same language, just reinterpreting it. And I think being that bridge is absolutely what the CTO role is all about. It's the bridge between engineering, execution, the delivery team in general. So often it's product and engineering, and the executive team, which are worried about operations, business strategy, sales, revenue, metrics, etc. And so being able to talk from one domain in terms that the other domain understands and gets is a crucial part of the CTO role. And I think a lot of the times I end up helping CTOs with that bit in terms of using, what's the shortcuts? How do you get to the point where you can quickly do that? And analogies is one of my favorite tricks. Yes, we can build this piece of software, but it's a bit like trying to replace the front left wheel on the car while it's driving. These kinds of things, different from changing the steering wheel, which you can do when you stop for a quick pit stop, but changing the tire is, you get the idea. And so using analogies is a quick shortcut for that communication, but also going back the other way as well. The business strategy now is to X, Y, Z. Okay, what does that mean for the engineers? How do I interpret that as a concept, and also what it means for them practically, what's going to change? That approach, I think, is something where, as you say, you can have worked in technology and engineering and still struggle to understand how I translate or interpret across what that means from the business side to the engineering and vice versa.
Yeah, and I think there's also a level of sharing the pain or transferring the pain. So what I was going to ask you is, well, what I was saying is around the sharing or the transferring of pain from one side to the other. So you have the business pain, if you're a product business or a service business and you're trying to sell what you're building, and you've got customers and they're complaining and you've got support issues, quality issues, etc. To the dev team who, let's be honest, shit rolls downhill, constantly building something, trying to fix things, etc., etc. So they have different pains, but because neither one has really experienced the other one's day in the life of, it's a difficult thing to get everyone linked up and in sync and join up. I mean, is that part of your coaching as well to some extent?
Absolutely. Yeah. That empathy between different departments, between different drivers on the struggle is a significant part of it. Because I think a lot of the time it comes down to explaining constraints in a way that is comprehensible to the other side, not just from the point of view, I understand the words, but actually I understand why and how it's important and why I need to actually take that into account rather than listen to it and go, yeah, whatever. Because I think that's one of those things that tends to happen. We all hear this parable really of the CTO that goes to the executive team and goes, I want to do this thing where we're going to, cut down on this technical debt, and we're going to need 2 people to do it. Take us 3 months. And by the way, we won't be able to deliver any features in the meantime. And everybody goes, yeah, no. But, if you get to that point where it's like, okay, look, if we don't make some changes, we're going to end up with our feature delivery grinding to a halt in about 3 to 6 months time. I don't know exactly when, but we can reduce the chance of that happening by rebuilding the small components of the system. I need 2 engineers for 2 months to do that, and it's going to slow down feature delivery. So we'll end up with about the same all the way along. Do we buy into this to reduce the risk? And so re-describing these constraints, these blockers on performance, and particularly with the projection of where it's going to be, because that's how revenue people think. That's how CEOs tend to think. It's where's my forecast? And as a CTO, if you can begin to bring your constraints into the same frame, it becomes a lot more palatable and a lot more, understandable.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, because I'm having these conversations at the moment and we've got a very unstable product. And the frustration is, the guys are dealing with the customers and the customers are complaining. And devs are not stressed. They're not observably stressed, which obviously for the people on the front line are going, well, I'm getting beaten up 12 hours a day, and the devs are, they're going surfing in the afternoon. And I'm like, well, they're not really going surfing in the afternoon, but I understand your pain. You're getting the verbal onslaught from your customer. They're saying, oh, well, we'll fix it next week because, there's other priorities. And it's just a case of exactly that, and I like what you said there, you got to change the perspective.
Yeah.
And start putting to say, well, we're not going to do it. We have to focus on stability right now. So we're not going to build the 6 things that you've sold. As
But
much as you
then,
did tell
the other thing that helps as well
yeah.
is, when you got devs and people will say, well, the devs don't really get it. And so one of the things I try and do is help them is to go, okay, well, let's put the devs on a support rota. Oh, I have to support the product this week. It's my support week. This is a typical kind of response. And what I try and do is go, well, look, rather than just being on third line support, where you're just receiving tickets and dealing with tickets that feel anonymous, remote, actually get onto the calls with the first line support. Get into the actual chat with the customer in the first line support. So you can see it from the very frontline perspective. So you can see the pain, because often what happens is an NG gets into that level, even if they're sort of fly on the wall observer, and they look at it and go, why didn't the customer just go here and click that? That like it's built to do that. Why? And then it's like, oh, okay, there's a missing bit of context and communication that happens. And boom, they don't need to go fix a ticket now. They just inform the first line support these things need to happen, rather than receiving a ticket that says, oh, when this happens, this other thing needs to happen over there. But that you're putting a fix on a fix that's actually already root cause done in a better way. It's just that the docs are crap. And so I try and close that gap as well, bring the engineers closer to the customers, closer to the pain point, because that's, and you get the empathy going the other way around. Plus also, I mean, engineers are creative people. And so if you bring them close to a problem, they'll get creative with the problem solving. It's what they do. And so then you end up with a better outcome because they understand the problem, the pain much more closely than they do when it's just, third party ticket coming in saying this needs a fix over there. That's the other problem. First line people tend to solutionize. Customer says they need to do this. The solution must be this. And they don't intend to do it, but it's just that when they've got to translate it from, customer in my face, having a problem right now, I need to fix it. That's what their, approach is. So here's how it needs to be fixed. Rather than thinking, okay, now I've got to reframe that into the problem is this, which is what engineers would prefer to get. Then it's, okay, now tell me what the problem is and I can come up with a better solution. And I find about 80% of the time, the solution is better documentation, because we all know how good engineers are at building documentation.
Yeah, and this is a constant argument: is how much documentation is enough and how much is too much. And also, even if you think about stories, acceptance criteria, and almost success criteria, agreeing that you actually need a definition of done, all those things. And I think in a lot of ways, the definition of done is really just a contract to say, well, you're going to build something. I know when you give it to me, it's going to meet this criteria. So it builds trust. Because I think a lot of this is just about trust. Because when you can trust somebody and you can have that honest conversation, hey, dude, you screwed this up. Yeah, no, I didn't meet the criteria. It's not an emotional, personalized attack. It's an acceptance that we had an agreement around what's the minimum acceptable.
And a lot of the times then it also comes down to outcome over output as well. What's the point of building this code? Well, it's so that customers can achieve this, so that, revenue rates go up, whatever it might be. And it's that outcome. If we can express things in terms of the outcome, then it's not, we're not being measured on the number of tickets we get through or the number of pull requests we deliver, or worse, the number of lines of code we write.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny. There are metrics that are useful to have. I mean, pull request is a good one if you're following a culture of, many pull requests, small pieces of work. The sort of git flow, which is build the whole feature and then put it in. It's a useful metric, but it's almost a vanity metric in some respects, and the same as too many lines of code. And then I think, when I look at some of these qualifications, and I haven't looked at them in depth, but I'm wondering how much of that is actually teaching the experience that you would have as a person who's been through the grill or the grind, where you've had to manage a team of people and you've had to do PRs and you have to do checks and you've had to refactor code and all that kind of stuff, versus the softer stuff. And I say softer, but the interpersonal things.
And I think that's the difference between a teaching course, which goes through, okay, when this happens, then this is a good set of frameworks to think about it and a good way to break it down and a good way to tackle the challenge that you've got. So you end up with a sort of a semi-predictable way of handling things, but then anything you get in is always slightly off center from the sort of the key line frameworks you get, but the frameworks are still useful nonetheless. Yeah. And I think that's the difference between a teaching course and coaching, where particularly the way that I approach coaching is that, well, let's take the things that are actually happening to you right now, and let's actually go back to first principles. How do I break down this situation into the first principle problem and build up a solution from those, fundamental building blocks? And that is a combination of, well, what are the things that you do know that you already know how to do? And what are the things that you've not encountered before that's a different way of thinking about the challenge that you're seeing in front of you or the behavior that you're experiencing? And that's why I think the blend of experience, seen this, done that, and framework, this is the standard common way of doing it that will be acceptable to other people and understandable to others too, is a very useful way to accelerate yourself as a CTO. So that the courses aren't wrong, they're perfectly correct, but they're never spot on to exactly what you see and what you encounter, because the array and range of things that you can see as a CTO in the role, and you'll know this from being fractional to a number of different places, is wild in terms of the variation you can get. And so that's the difference between coaching and teaching, really.
Yeah, and I think it's a maturity thing to some extent too. Have you got a good mature team that has been through a couple experiences, they've bonded, they're self-organizing, they've got a process, they just need some tweaking or some coaching, reflective coaching.
Yeah.
Because they already know the answer in most cases. They just don't always have the confidence to execute on it. Versus a team that's completely disorganized, thrown together, whatever, got some really bad habits that's perpetuated, and you have to do a lot more hands-on fixing, so to say, than coaching. But yeah, you're right. I mean, and also corporate versus small business,
very different, right?
Completely.
You need to have a different approach and a different level of structure to the way you approach things in a corporate where you've got many more people, and often to the communication between somebody who's making a decision and the person who's going to be impacted by that. There's often 2, 3, 4 degrees of freedom in terms of the number of different roles or intermediate people that decision making is going to be communicated through.
What are your feelings around the sort of, I mean, if you look at the startup culture, often it's a founder or 2 founders or whatever, and they've outsourced the development of their product versus having an inside team versus outside. I mean, do you see one works better than the other, or is it kind of depends on so many things?
I mean, it depends on many things, right? Because sometimes you end up with a domain knowledge that's so crucial that to build it externally will be you're basically trying to download somebody's brain to a third party outside, people to try and build it. So that there's all sorts of potholes and traps in the road there. On the other way around, if you're trying to do something very straightforward and off the shelf, and you bring an in-house team in, it may be slower and more expensive than if you're just taking an outfit who are just going to find the quickest, shortest way to put something together that uses as many third-party tools as possible. Because when you bring engineers in, they tend, they tend to have the approach of, well, we'll build and keep the IP in-house. So there's whether they intend to or not, there is a subliminal not invented here syndrome that appears. So no one way is better than the other. You've got to pick the right thing, the right approach you take for what it is you're trying to do. And the more specific the outcome, the more likely you need to bring a team in. The big trap that I see, though, is the same no matter which of those 2 approaches you take. And that is that all the sort of literature, the founder stuff, you build your MVP, and then you've got your team one way or another, right? And then we transition to building the long thing long term. And there's this magic moment in the middle where you go, there we go, we're out of MVP, we've got a product, and we're going to build and scale now. And that bit is often a trap, because right in there hides all of that technical debt and shortcuts you took just to figure out how the MVP actually fits and hits the market, versus now we've got a platform upon which we can build. And when you sort of explain to people, okay, if you're always going to do this with a prototype widget that I build out of things and stuff, and I do it once, and then I want to transfer from there to using a factory to churning out thousands and thousands of them, do you think I can jump from that prototype widget that's held together with glue and sticky back plastic to something that's going through a fab process in a factory? No, you can see the difference there. And yet we're trying to do that with software. There's something missing in the middle. And so this idea that, okay, we've got our MVP, it is a proof of concept, it's a conceptual thing, we need to throw it away and build it again industrially. But that step is missing from the whole, concept business plan that goes on there. And so therefore this trap is fallen into time and time again. And I see that regardless of whether somebody's built an in-house team first or they've offshored it to somewhere, to churn out a version of what it is they're trying to build.
100%. I mean, so Valuu, my product, we built it on a low code, no code platform called Bubble. I always knew that in a period of time, and my wife beats me up about this often, and she's South African, so she beats me up really badly. And I said to her, when I built this thing, I always knew we'd have to rebuild it. Always knew it. Because we're going to put it out there, we're going to test it a few pilots, which we did. And all the things that we preconceived to, even though I ran pilots and I knew where it was going, I just knew we'd have to rebuild it. And that's where we are right now. And I'm curious to know your opinion on building it from scratch using, normal code writing, let's say, versus the low code, no code evolution, which is now going to be replaced, I guess, with agents, AI agents they're going to build for you, because I'm seeing a lot of those coming along. It's part of the evolution of things. I mean, it's not like a house that would last 30, 40 years before you rebuild it. In tech,
And I think the
tech
landscape
terms,
is changing crazy fast as well. Go
Yeah.
back 5 years, and to build an MVP prototype would cost you, somewhere upwards of $1.5 million USD, because you then you've got to pull in a
Yeah.
small team, you've got to have a number of people. It's
Yeah.
going to take you several months to put it together. You got to build everything from the database to the front end and any CI/CD you want with that. Get it out there, high iterations. So you need a certain amount of developer experience protocol in there to be able to get the high iterations out. Learn what you need to from the customer base, and then you've got your put together thing with all the shortcuts and fixes on fixes in there that were relevant to figuring out what the customers actually pay for, and then
Yeah.
go from there. Now you can do the same thing. Yeah, Bubble, great platform for doing low code, no code. You can go the sort of AI built route. Well, hang on. So Bubble was around for 2-3 years ago. It really became popular growing up. We've now got this agentic approach. We've got the AI accelerated developer, with Lovable, and
I haven't seen this Lovable. So you mentioned it twice now. I'm gonna
Yeah.
look at that while we're talking.
it's a very similar platform, right? It's a AI throw an app together very quick, but it's built here in Sweden, team in Stockholm. I mean, there's, I think Giant, was it Code Giant, is another one that's very similar in terms of AI putting together an app that can be built upon even further using the AI, that uses fairly sophisticated high level starting components, and it makes it quick and straightforward for somebody who's not technical to pull together an app and tell it how it wants to look in plain English. It's coding in English, basically, which opens up what you want to build to an awful lot larger base of start. But what's happened, the point here really is that the starting point and the cost have gone in opposite directions. You can go for longer with a small amount of money before you need to get serious about turning your prototype into a real platform. So if you're starting now and you're going to base what you do now on the last 5 years, or which point in those 5 years do you take as your starting point is when you're going to go from? You should be starting from right now, right? But then the amount of experience other people have around that in terms of what's happening, well, it's changed so much that you got maybe 6 months people into the current way of building things. So you're going to be on the cutting edge, you're going to be on the bleeding edge. And that's the option you've got right now. If you want to go tried and trusted, well, you're using sort of last generation's approach. It's only 2 years old, but there isn't that much experience to go with it. And so the industry has moved so fast that it's made that whole process quite complex and quite risky. And so, experience is counting for less and less as the pace of evolution continues.
It's so funny you say that, because I've now spoken to probably a dozen, let's call them technologists. I don't want to say CTOs because they're all over the spectrum. And these are very smart guys, and they're all building stuff at the moment. And we all come from the school of how we built it 20 years ago. All the things you said. I mean, I remember a product called Iron Speed, which you used to just design the database and it used to generate all the screens for you. And I thought that was amazing. And I didn't have any money to pay for the license for it, but because it was like $4,000, and I was like, 16 at the time. And I was in rand, not dollars. But in a lot of ways, a lot of these tools are just mimicking that. But chatting to all these guys, the many AI-driven code generators. I mean, their Reapp, I think, is the one. I can't think of the name of the one. I'm actually interviewing them in a couple of days. But they'll generate the app using the text prompt, but the code's not very good. So, and I'm curious to know I'm curious to hear what you think. The future, if you think about a dev team, tech lead, a senior dev, a couple intermediates, a couple juniors, a product manager, maybe some testers, a UX designer, whatever that construct used to be. What's that going to look like in the future with all these augmentations around generating UI, generating the database, generating the APIs, using prompts for the most part?
Yeah, the cost, time, and accuracy are all going in the right direction in terms of what one engineer, technologist, good approach, technologist can do. So I mean, if you go back 5-10 years, the challenge was you got this great idea. You got a very clear idea of what it is that you want to do for the customer. You just don't know whether the customer is going to pay for it. Translating your mind's eye view of the solution into a working prototype the bottleneck was in building the code, creating the software that would put together to get in front of the user.
Yep.
The comparative difficulty of, backwards and forwards with users learning about what you want to do and translating intent into visuals was the cheap bit. That ratio is inverting. And so now generating and creating the software that outputs what it is that actually is a working, usable software or prototype, whatever it is, the cost of that has come down and the quality is going up simultaneously. The challenge of understanding what the user wants, interpreting the data you get back from usage, figuring out intent from what the user needs to do, jobs to be done, versus how the solution needs to do that, has not changed in terms of the complexity or cost. And so what's happening now is that where we used to have one product person, 4 engineers, 1 DevOps, and a fraction of a design person in your typical team, that's now flipping over to now having 1 senior engineer, 2 product people, and a fraction of a designer. And so that ratio has fundamentally changed. And yet in the market, what do we see? We still see loads and loads of product people who don't have work. We've got engineers who are, figuring out where they fit in the world. Are they junior, mid, senior? Or how likely are they to get a job? How much AI do they need to do? We've got junior engineers turning into senior AI-driven engineers very rapidly. We've got senior engineers who are not taking advantage of the AI because they don't have the opportunity, their company forbids it, whatever, sort of drifting into mid territory because they're not keeping up with the skills and the current pace of movement. And so it's really, take the rug from the whole industry and just yank it out. And that's what's happening. So for me to try and use a crystal ball and tell you this is what's happening, your guess is as good as mine. But one thing I would say is that the drift towards product and being a product engineer, that's time well spent.
Yeah. And it's funny. So Phoenix One, which I'm involved in, is a low-code, no-code platform for fintech apps. And the idea behind that was that a product person could build their app and the builders would build the app. So you drag and drop your screens, you create them on the app or the desktop, whatever it is, and all the code that you need is generated behind that. So if you drag on a company house search widget, for example, and you want to now search for Valuu AI Limited, dragging that onto the screen will create all the code you need behind that. It'll just ask you for the API key that you probably need for company's house, and that's it. You don't have to code anything. But where I think I've seen some other stuff which I find very interesting, because one of the biggest problems, if from my days as a developer, even today, if I talk to a team and I want to get onboarded, is setting up your dev environment can take you like 2 days. Just because of all the things you got to connect to and get access to and download and da. And a lot of these tools that I'm seeing, which I quite like, is they're basically just solving that problem. So you go into an interface that's already got all the stuff behind you configured. And with that time from commit the code to it being released in the environment has been simplified. And then you can code analysis that's happening where the LLMs are saying, oh, we looked at your code and you can improve your efficiency by 2% if you just remove this check or whatever it is. What worries me about this, and I'm kind of going around a few things here, is that pain that we would have gone through as professionals learning how to code and making mistakes. The augmentation is taking that away. So you're not actually understanding why it's better. You're just getting told it's better, and and people will just accept it.
And yet, when we get to that stage where we need to go from thousands to tens to hundreds of thousands of users, the bottlenecks, the predictability of scaling is still as unpredictable as ever. It's still very much like a black swan thing. So by the time you get to that point where you're going from, successful running business to, okay, now we need to scale it up to, to really rack up the usage, there is still these weird cliff points where the app works fine, the whole thing falls off a cliff because you've gone from, 1 million to 1,050,000 in terms of usage, whatever metric it is you're using. And that's where you still need to understand the fundamentals of memory management, of allocation, of processor platform, of network communication, of architecture and topology of your app. And so therefore 100%. We still need the seniors who understand all of that stuff. But as you say, the threshold where you need to get down to that level of understanding is moving up significantly.
Well, go ahead. Oh, you saw with cloud. I mean, people don't understand, if you haven't built servers the old-fashioned way in a data center or in your server room in the back of the office, and then you've now gone to a data center and someone else has built the server, but you need to still understand how that's going to connect to you and all that stuff, to the point that now you just turn on an app service on Azure or whatever. If you have to troubleshoot that stuff, if you don't know how it works, how do you even start to troubleshoot it?
Yeah. And those of us who've, built networks and taken disconnected networks, into the field and put things together, got all the way down to Linux networking and so on. That knowledge is still around, but it's a little bit like the old COBOL developers. It's gonna become less and less necessary. So it's gonna become a very specialist field for those people who need to work in, for example, secure environments where you can't be connected to something else, or where you need to have a very custom network configuration to defend against very particular kinds of network attacks or mass attacks against things. And so I think this is just one of those shifts that will happen in the industry. It's a bit like serverless, right?
Yeah.
You don't, if you go serverless, you pay a bit more for it, but when it scales down to zero, you're paying nothing. So you can pay a lot less overall. But if your thing ramps up and runs at consistent scale for a while, then it gets quite expensive. Then suddenly it's like, okay, now we need to re-architect to bring the price down. And what we're seeing is, rather than being complexity, budget, or performance off a cliff, sometimes it is a case of the bug in the whole thing is not the technology suddenly stopping, it's the dollars suddenly being prohibitive. And so
and I sat in a session 2 weeks ago, and the guy, I don't want to mention his name because I want his permission, but he made such a good point about this. When you're building a product and you're doing a return, because obviously I do a lot of it return on value. Like, you're going to build this thing, what's return on value? The problem with return on value is it's got a time scale to it. So you're going to build this product, and at the end of the year, you're going to make $1 million. Okay, but it's going to cost you $500,000 to build it. Let's just keep it simple. The problem with cloud is those costs start straight away. So the business sees this cost every month of 20 grand, and they're going, but where's my product? I got to make revenue. So that patience for return on value at the end of the year is not there, because if they had the internal, if they had the internal servers and stuff, they would have bought the servers once or reuse some stuff. But because you're paying for compute every month on these cloud environments, it becomes harder and harder to manage expectations, because the CFO is going, I'm spending a lot of money here. You better return this value to me. And if the project gets delayed for whatever reason, good reason or bad reason, it becomes more and more painful, because someone still has to pay that bill every month.
Yeah. And this is where I think many CTOs who come from that, 3 people building a product, 2 founders, 1 tech, 1 not. And then you get to this point of, okay, so how much is this going to cost? What's my cost of goods sold? What's my ratio of income versus, spend?
Yeah.
And they don't have this grounding in the finance aspects or how to calculate these things, because you haven't needed it up until now. You're not in a fintech, so why learn the finance, right?
Well,
so and then I think that the CTOs especially suddenly hit this kind of, oh, okay, now I'm at a business level role at CTO level, which you weren't. The engineering lead, VP engineering, you suddenly jump into, okay, now I've got to understand the numbers, and the numbers are non-trivial. The science behind the finances. I mean, we're talking, it goes back to Venetian banking, right, as we said before. And so there's quite a lot of domain knowledge to suddenly pick up for a domain that up until now has been like, well, not really that important. And that's one of those areas where I think coaching can make a significant difference to help you out.
Yeah, and I mean, FinOps is becoming a very important area for someone to understand. And I mean, you look at licensing, we always used to joke about, if you want to understand Microsoft licensing, you have to go and do an aeronautical degree, because it's not kept simple on purpose.
Yeah.
But I think, that to me is where the CTO, from an experience point of view, is so important, because they know what to look for.
Yeah. And what does normal look like? What does a normal balance sheet look like when you look at your engineering team? I come across CTOs who really have no idea about where their costs go. And then when I explain to them, okay, look, most of your cost is probably going to be sunk into your salaries every month. Your second biggest cost is probably going to be cloud. And third is probably on your licenses. And everything else falls into a bucket, which is, small percentages of, margin of error. And just that knowledge on its own can actually be quite significant to people coming into this job for the first time. So and it's obvious to people who've been a CTO for a while. As soon as you've gone through the budgeting cycle once or twice, like, okay, I've got a feel for this. But the first time through, that can be a bit of a shock. Oh, wow, we spend that much money on salaries? Really?
Yeah. And we were talking about today, a person developing paid X will reach a point that they'll look around them and say, they'll look around and say, I could earn more over there, because they need somebody urgently. And it doesn't matter that they're not their skills haven't changed per se, but you can jump around a lot. I mean, your point's right, but we are coming close to time. Is there anything else you want to share before we close off?
No, I mean, from my perspective, that you mentioned before about how people can get hold of me. So I think LinkedIn is probably one of the best ways to get there, to come and find me. If you want to hear more of my wonderful voice, of course, there's a podcast that I run as well. It's called The CTO Playbook. So you can find that on all the platforms, or you can follow the links from the show notes. that's me.
Super. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to our episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please share it with your friends and colleagues. Help us grow our network. Please also check out our website at www.valuu.work and our product that's on there. It's something we worked really hard on. We hope to benefit you.